Silence, please. All stand. This Coroner's Court is now sitting.
Good morning. Yes, Mr. Castleton.
My pleasure, and I appear with my learned friends, Ms Waters, Senior Counsel, Mr Harker and Mr Wilcox, assisting Your Honour.
Thank you. I'll just take any other appearances.
Your Honour, my surname is Pintos Lopez, and I appear on behalf of Essential Energy. I seek leave to appear, Your Honour, if it hasn't already been granted.
Leave is granted.
Thank you, Your Honour. And if it's acceptable to Your Honour, if Ms Wilkinson can be present here at the bar table, my instructor.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Your Honour, my name is Woodland. I appear for the Commissioner of the Rural Fire Service, the National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales.
Thank you, Ms Woodland.
May it please the Court, my name is Ransom and I appear on behalf of IAG.
Thank you, Ms Ransom.
I think that concludes appearances, Your Honour. Your Honour, this morning's hearing commences the general inquiry into the Falford Road Darrawang fire pursuant to section 32, subsection 3 of the Coroners Act. The sole issue for consideration is the appropriateness of Essential Energy's bushfire risk classification approach, including underpinning modelling in the lead up to the 2019-2020 bushfire season and as is currently applied. In March of this year, Your Honour heard evidence as to the cause and origin of the Falford Road Darrawang fire. Briefly put, the evidence indicated that the fire was caused by at least one branch falling onto power lines. This resulted in arcing, which emitted embers onto dry foliage, igniting the fire. Over a period of about 3 weeks, the fire went on to burn 3,000 hectares across the Mid-Coast local government area within the lands of the Worimi people. It impacted communities including Falford, Rainbow Flat and Hallidays Point. The purpose of the general inquiry today is for Your Honour to consider evidence going to the important issue of how Essential Energy classifies bushfire risk severity zones in the parts of the state serviced by its energy infrastructure. This in turn is important in understanding how Essential Energy's vegetation management program applies to reduce the risk of vegetation impacting upon electrical assets. Essential Energy manages the vegetation surrounding its power lines having regard to a bushfire risk classification procedure. That procedure classifies the Essential Energy network using 4 categories of bushfire risk. P1 being high risk severity, P2 moderate risk severity, P3 low risk severity, and finally P4 non-bushfire prone. The level of vegetation maintenance undertaken by Essential Energy varies depending upon the risk level adopted. By way of example, under its vegetation management plan, Essential Energy firstly adopts a clear-to-sky vegetation management approach for all bare conductors, not including steel, from 33,000 volts to 132,000 volts within an area classified as P1 high risk. And Your Honour, I'll just have displayed now an image taken from Essential Energy's vegetation management plan. Clear to sky is a requirement that vegetation must not encroach within minimum clearance distances at any point overhead of electrical assets. In areas, Your Honour, classified as P2 and P3, the same standard is only to be maintained for high voltage distribution mains where clear to sky has previously been achieved. Otherwise, the policy provides that the application of the clear to sky approach is a matter for Essential Energy's discretion. Before the 2019-2020 bushfire season, Essential Energy also ran a pre-summer bushfire inspection program in areas with a P1, that is a high risk severity, bushfire risk classification. You're on about 8% of Essential Energy's overhead power lines are classified by Essential Energy as falling within the highest category of risk, namely P1. The transmission lines, identified as the likely cause of the Falford Road Darrawang fire, are classified as P2, being a moderate risk severity. At the hearing on the 23rd of March 2002, Mr Paul Demar gave evidence that, in his expert opinion, a large branch was weakened by strong winds and fell, striking a smaller branch that was higher up on the tree but within the larger branch's reach. According to Mr Demar, both branches made contact with two of the three spans of conductors. The contact between the branches and the conductors caused electricity to pass through the branches, generating embers which led to a fire igniting on the dry vegetation beneath the power lines. Mr Demar had regard to Google Street View images of the location from 2018. And Your Honour will see shortly page 2-222 of the brief of evidence, which identifies the relevant conductors and branches. And Mr Demar identified that the subject branches extended well above the conductors at that time, 2018, meaning they would have fallen down onto the conductors in the event of the branches breaking. Although growing above the conductors, it was Mr Demar's opinion that the branches were outside the minimum clearance requirements in Essential Energy's vegetation and management policies. The area of the Darrawank fire was not classified by Essential Energy as within its highest classification of bushfire danger, namely P1. This meant that there was no clear-to-sky requirement. Furthermore, the area did not receive a pre-summer bushfire inspection. The subject tree was also in generally good health and did not appear structurally unsound. Mr Demar noted termite damage within the larger fallen trunk would not have been visually apparent from an external inspection prior to the trunk having fallen. Under Essential Energy's policies, the subjective tree was not a hazard tree and did not pose a fall-in vegetation hazard as defined under the applicable policy. Mr Hargrave, Vegetation Officer with Essential Energy, agreed with Mr Demar's opinions, save for a disagreement as to the identity of one of the branches that impacted the conductors. He accordingly disagreed as to the extent of overhang of the branch which impacted on the conductors. After giving oral evidence, Mr Hargrave undertook a further site inspection of the subject tree and review of the documentary material. In a statement of 6 April 2022, Mr Hargrave ultimately agreed with Mr Demar as to the identification of the branches which impacted the conductors. In circumstances where Essential Energy appears to have complied with its vegetation management policies and yet a substantial fire still occurred, the question arises as to whether the classifications underpinning those policies are fit for purpose. It is on this issue that the Court will hear today from, firstly, Mr Paul Demar, Principal Consultant, Natural Resources and Agricultural Service Group within professional services consulting firm GHD Proprietary Limited. Next, Professor Jason Sharples from the University of New South Wales. And finally, Mr Ian Fitzpatrick, Manager Network Risk Strategy with Essential Energy. Both Mr Demar and Professor Sharples are of the opinion that the bushfire risk classification adopted by Essential Energy is inadequate, but for different reasons. Mr Fitzpatrick disagrees. Mr Demar has approached the issue in part by contrasting some Essential Energy areas zoned low or moderate risk severity with statutory Rural Fire Service approved bushfire risk management plans, which categorise the same area as extreme or very high risk. In the Darrawank example, the settlements near the area where the fire burned were assigned a risk rating of very high under the Mid-Coast Bushfire Risk Management Plan, while other settlements in the same local government area had a risk rating of extreme. Mr Demar noted that Essential Energy did not identify any P1 high-risk severity zones on the entire northern coast of New South Wales. Mr Demar concluded that Essential Energy's bushfire risk severity modelling was out of step with the statutory bushfire risk management plans and was therefore, in his opinion, flawed. Mr Fitzpatrick has responded to some of these criticism. He explains that from 2010, Essential Energy developed an interim internal model of bushfire risk classification for their electricity assets. It comprised the Essential Energy Fire Risks Model, a likelihood-based system informed by historical network fire starts and total fire ban declarations, which complemented a consequence-based model using the Phoenix Rapid Fire product. The Phoenix Rapid Fire product, Your Honour, was developed in 2014 and was identified by the Powerline Bushfire Safety Task Force, established to oversee the implementation of select recommendations from the 2019 Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, as the best available tool to assess fire loss consequence at that time. Mr Fitzpatrick notes that Essential Energy's bushfire risk modelling is different from statutory bushfire risk management plans because the two systems have different objectives. Mr Fitzpatrick notes that if Essential Energy relied on statutory bushfire risk management plans alone to define their vegetation management requirements, this would have significant cost implications given the breadth of Essential Energy's electricity network. Mr Fitzpatrick drew out a number of other differences between the two models in his evidence before Your Honour. Mr Fitzpatrick also notes that the mid-coast local government area is a humid, subtropical climate, which is typically at lower risk than dry summer climate zones. He pointed out that Essential Energy is currently undertaking work with Climate Change Modelling Organisation, Risk Frontiers, to model forecasted climate change conditions to the extent they impact Essential Energy's network. In a second expert report dated the 4th of August this year, Mr Damar gave an opinion on the methodology used by Essential Energy to determine levels of bushfire risk in response to specific questions. Mr Damar is of the opinion that Phoenix Level 1 classification, modelling a fire resulting in house loss exceeding 2,000 houses, and Level 2 classification, modelling a fire resulting in house loss between 500 to 2,000 houses, were both excessively high. He noted no single fire in New South Wales has ever destroyed more than 500 houses. Additionally, it is expected that Mr Damar will give evidence that Phoenix Level 3 classification, modelling house loss in the range of 10 to 500 houses, is a very wide range that covered all but 6 of Australia's worst bushfire disaster incidents and all of those which occurred in New South Wales. In his reports, Mr Damar has noted only one single non-complex fire in recorded Australian history has ever destroyed more than 1,000 houses, and he noted only 4 examples nationally of a single fire destroying more than 500 houses. Having regard to this background, it is expected that Mr Damar will give evidence that Essential Energy's bushfire risk consequence modelling indicates the house loss thresholds applied for each level are out of alignment with the bushfire risk context in New South Wales. Your Honour, it is anticipated that he will give evidence of his own proposed fresh consequence category thresholds. It is also expected that Mr Damar will give evidence that Essential Energy fire risk likelihood methodology and mapping does not adequately account for regional differences across the state. This is based on the opinion, as set out in his reports, that it substantially underclassifies bushfire risk, particularly in the North Coast region, but also in parts of the southern and northern regions. This may explain why Essential Energy's bushfire risk assessment in the mid-North Coast is out of alignment with the Mid-Coast Statutory Bushfire Risk Management Plan. Your Honour, Professor Sharples has considered Essential Energy's bushfire risk classification from a slightly different angle. In his report, Professor Sharples focuses on the underlying simulations, models and profiles that underpin the risk classification. These include, Your Honour, most relevantly, a house loss index that is derived from simulations in the Phoenix software, which is, in general terms, based on 5 dates in January and October of 2013, and models of fire behaviour and spread developed from house surveys undertaken in the aftermath of the 2009 Victorian Black Saturday fires. They also include a risk profile map developed by Essential Energy, which adopts 4 input layers. First, Australian bushfire potential zones, based on a 1995 study. That's a study by Johnson et al. Second, fire start history for the Essential Energy regional network. Third, the average regional frequency of total fire ban declarations. And finally, Your Honour, a spatial pattern of historical fire damage and house loss. It is expected that Your Honour will hear from Professor Sharples that the house loss index is not presently appropriate and fit for purpose and should instead be based upon climatological analysis of regional fire conditions rather than a more generalised risk assessment based on a small number of bad fire days across the state. This is because the generalised approach is unlikely to account for regional climate variability. Similarly, it is anticipated that Professor Sharples will give evidence, in line with his expert report, that Essential Energy's profile map does not incorporate the best information available. Some of the data is dated and does not account for more recent and projected increases in the annual average cumulative forest fire danger index, the FFDI. Your Honour will also hear from Mr Fitzpatrick and Professor Sharples about a newer method adopted by Energy Networks Australia, known as the Ignis Project, that is IGNIS project. That project seeks to understand fire risk related to electricity networks by combining fire simulation, economic analyses and Bayesian analysis. And John, I'll just have displayed now a diagram that provides you want to see the flowchart. This flowchart's come from Mr Fitzpatrick's statement, most recent statement, his 4th statement of the 21st of September, page 7. Both Mr Fitzpatrick and Professor Sharples disagree as to whether the final stage, that is the Bayesian modelling, accounts sufficiently for uncertainties arising from the other 3 stages. Mr Fitzpatrick states in his most recent statement that the probability, not just the impact of fires associated with the network, are accounted for by the Bayesian component, which includes tables of relevant variables such as the weather and the fire danger index for particular locations. Your Honour, it is anticipated that Professor Sharples will give evidence to the contrary that if any of these first 3 stages of the Ignis project are flawed, for example because the inputs are bad, then the final component will not account for the full range of potential uncertainties tied to the assessment of bushfire risk and potential house loss. Ultimately, whilst it is a step in the right direction, there may be more to be done. Your Honour, that concludes my opening remarks. I understand that Mr Paul Demar is in the virtual waiting room, and I'd ask if he could be brought in, and my learned friend Ms Ward, Senior Counsel, will take Mr Demar's evidence.
Mr Demar, can you see and hear us in the courtroom?
Yes, I can.
All right, you'll just hear from the court officer now.
Thanks, Your Honour.
Silence, please. Do you swear by Almighty God that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Thank you. Yes, Ms Ward.
Thank you, Your Honour. Would you state your name, occupation and professional address?
My name is Paul James DeMar. My address is 34 Duff Street, Turramurra in New South Wales, and I'm a consultant in the fields of forest and vegetation management and bushfire risk management.
In that capacity, have you prepared 2 expert reports to assist the court's inquiry into the Falford Road Darrawank fire?
Yes, I have.
Would you agree the first report's dated the 11th of February 2022 and the second the 4th of August 2022?
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. DeMar, did you attend to give oral evidence at earlier proceedings in the cause and origin phase of the Darrawank fire inquiry in March of this year?
Yes, I did.
Focusing then on those 2 statements, are there any matters requiring correction within either of the statements?
No, I don't wish to make any corrections.
And is the evidence and the opinions that you express within those statements true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Since your statement of 4 August 2022, have you received and read a report from Professor Jason Sharples dated 22 August of this year?
Yes, I have.
And have you also received and read a 3rd supplementary statement of Mr. Ian Fitzpatrick dated 21 September of this year?
Yes, I have.
Do you wish to address anything raised in either of those documents, going to the opinions that you had expressed in either of your earlier statements?
No, I don't.
Your Honour, that's the evidence in chief.
Yes, thank you. I'll just see if there's any questions now, Mr. DeMar. Mr. Pintos Lopez.
Thank you, Your Honour. Mr. DeMar, can you see and hear me? I'm not sure if I've got the...
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Mr. DeMar, just a few questions. I'm appearing on behalf of Essential Energy. Now, you're aware, I believe, that when Essential began to develop its methodology after 2010, as a distributor, it had no necessary in-house expertise in fire modelling.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
And so in that context, it sought and relied upon the advice of experts such as Dr. Tolhurst.
Yes.
And in addition, you'd probably be aware from the statement of Mr. Fitzpatrick that it consulted the Rural Fire Service as well in the development of its methodology.
I'm generally aware of that. I don't really have any awareness of what form that consultation took, but I do understand that they consulted with the Rural Fire Service.
Yes. And you'd agree that for a distributor, and you're familiar with many distributors across the country, that was a reasonable thing to do.
Yes, I do.
Now, one of the matters that you raise in your second report, Mr. DeMar, is the mapping that is done, or you refer to some maps based on the work of bushfire management committees, and you compare the risk classifications to the mapping done by Essential.
Yes.
And just trying to tease out, if you like, some of the differences in the purposes of the 2 different organisations and bodies. You'd agree with me that the bushfire management committees operate very much at the local level, or sort of a sub-regional level?
Yes, that's correct.
And you'd also agree that they're not part of a single statewide assessment?
That's correct.
And in that context, you'd also agree with me that, or do you agree that the way in which they develop those plans and identify areas is very much based on the views of the people on those committees.
Yes, they do so, but within applying a bushfire risk management model framework that's a state level model. So they're applying local knowledge and local, intuitive processes for assessing risk, but doing so, adopting a statewide bushfire risk assessment model that is provided to them.
Yes, and it's a framework that you're familiar with.
Yes, it is, yeah.
Now, in that context, would you agree that it's more of a qualitative assessment rather than a quantitative assessment that's done by these committees?
Very much so.
Thank you. And so in that sense, it's not driven by data per se, it's very much based on the local knowledge of those individuals.
Yes, it's not driven by data, relating to risk. There are many data points at which they assess risk. There's quite a rigorous risk register that identifies all the at-risk assets that are within the jurisdiction of the committee, but they do apply a qualitative process in assigning risk.
And yes, and I'm not suggesting it's not rigorous. I'm just suggesting that it's perhaps got a different methodology to it, and you seem to agree. There's just one other difference I wanted to highlight with you, Mr. Demar, which is that the Bushfire Management Committees are concerned with all potential ignition sources, whereas you'd agree that essential energy is focused on ignition that might be associated with power lines.
Yes, I agree.
So, given the three differences that we've talked about, you're not surprised then that there are some quite significant differences between the results that you get from these two different methodologies.
Look, I am surprised that there are. I'm not surprised that there are differences. What I am surprised at is just how different those differences can be. So I think in my report I identified areas that under the bushfire risk management planning framework are identified as extreme risk, whereas they're identified as low risk in essential energies risk assessment. So yes, I would certainly expect some differences, but it's the magnitude of those differences that surprised me, I guess.
Yes, but given what we were saying before a moment ago, you certainly appreciate from what Mr. Fitzpatrick has described that it's an evolving process. It's something that Essential has been learning about and developing. Yes,
absolutely.
Now, I just wanted to clarify one more thing with you, Mr. Demar. You'd accept that the methodology we've been talking about that Essential uses is one that combines consequence of fire and fire risk.
No, it combines consequence and likelihood to determine risk.
Yes. Well, forgive I could have been more accurate, perhaps. But you understand that the Essential methodology, the Essential Energy methodology, is a decision support system. It's information.
Yes, I do. Yep.
And so, in your report, when you are identifying issues with the methodology, you're really talking about that decision support system.
Well, yes, I guess so. It's the methodology that I'm commenting on in my report.
Yes, but you're not commenting, for example, on the range of maintenance activities that fall within the different classifications.
No, I've very much tried to understand. In my first report, I identified that there was this anomaly in risk assessment, and in my second report, I've really tried to unpack, using the information that was provided, how that differential has come about. I haven't gone into looking at what risk reduction methods are applied by the distributor in relation to the assessed risk.
Yes, but you'd accept that, and I believe you do accept in your report that it's actually desirable to prioritise resources because it's such a large area, such a large network area that Essential manages.
Yes, I do.
No further questions, Your Honour. Thank you, Mr. DeMar.
Ms Woodland
No questions, Your Honour.
and Ms Ransom.
No questions, Your Honour.
Anything arising, Ms Woodland?
No, thank you, Your Honour.
Thanks very much, Mr DeMar. You're excused.
Your Honour.
Your Honour, the next witness is Professor Sharples, who's appearing in person. I call Professor Sharples.
Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the information you give will be the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Thank you. Professor, have a seat, please.
Professor, would you please state your full name?
My name is Jason John Sharples.
And would you please state your present occupation?
I'm a Professor of Bushfire Dynamics at the University of New South Wales.
And have you provided an expert report dated the 22nd of August 2022 in relation to this matter?
I have, yes.
Do you have a copy of that report with you?
I do, yep.
Do you hold degrees in science and mathematics?
Yes.
And do you also hold a Doctor of Philosophy in Mathematics from the University of Canberra?
Correct.
And are you internationally recognised as an expert in dynamic bushfire behaviour and extreme bushfire development?
Yes.
Do you adhere to the opinions you've expressed in your report dated the 22nd of August 2022?
Yeah, I do.
You're asked a number of questions and you've responded to each of those questions. The first question that you were asked was this: whether the house loss index produced by Phoenix simulations for identifying bushfire risk classification, that is the essential energy bushfire risk classifications, in the lead up to preparing for the 2019-2020 bushfire season was appropriate and fit for its intended purpose. What was your conclusion in response to that question?
I mean, in general, no, it wasn't. The house loss index, I think, kind of got it mostly correct just by happenstance for that particular region, but in general, applied across the whole state, no.
And what limitations or issues did you identify in relation to the house loss index, Professor?
There was two main ones. The first one is it's driven by simulations using the Phoenix model, and those simulations were driven by conditions drawn from particular bad fire days. Okay, five fire days in 2013.
And they're the dates of 2 dates in January and 3 dates in October from 2000.
8th and the 18th of January, 10th, 13th and 17th of October, yep. Yeah, so those days, while, as I state in my report, while these were bad fire days, and there were certainly some bad fires happening in and around those days, it's not really appropriate to just kind of pick 5 days. I mean, there's no justification for why these days were chosen other than to say that they represented a 1 in 30-year return. There doesn't seem to be any statistical analysis to support that. So what would normally be done is you would look at all the data available across the whole state and try and make some inferments about what's the worst fire conditions for particular regions based on all the available data.
And when you refer to data, are you referring to climatological data?
Yeah, so essentially temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, drought factor.
And over what, in your opinion, over what period would make that analysis more robust?
Well, the longer the better. And I mean, if you're looking at something which is climatologically meaningful, you're looking at something of the order of 30 years.
And from your analysis of the house loss index, it was just looking at 5 bad fire days for January and October of 2013.
Yeah, so 5 days in a particular year, which, there's no guarantee that those conditions on those days are going to represent the worst conditions at every part of your state.
Were there any other limitations that you identified in relation to the house loss index?
Yes, I mean, the other component of the house loss index is the probabilistic models of Tolhurst and Chong, 2011. Again, they're driven by simulations, and essentially what they're doing there is they're looking at house loss data and then matching it with simulated fire behaviour characteristics from the Phoenix model. Now, I guess one of the most concerning things for me is in that analysis they found that embers were a kind of a lesser factor in determining, in driving house loss.
Just pausing there, are there 3 factors that drive that? There's convection, radiation, and then ember density?
Yeah, so you're looking at basically houses being impacted by radiant heat, okay, just the normal heat you feel off a campfire. You're talking about houses being impacted by convective heat or direct flame contact. So this is heat being pushed by the air, moving with the air.
Is that both height and depth?
It's three-dimensional. Yeah, so that can be. I mean, a lot of it goes up, but some of it will go forward if the wind's strong enough. And then the other one is the ember attack. Now, there's been quite a few studies, particularly after the 2003 Canberra fires, which have really given us the strong picture that a lot of house loss, or the majority of house loss, is actually resulting from ember attack, not so much radiant heat and convective impacts.
Now, you mentioned the 2011 paper by Tolhurst and Chong. Since 2011, what's the most recent literature in relation to the effects of ember density in relation to a house loss index?
I mean, there was the paper of Leonard and Blanky, 2005, I think. That's kind of set the standard, but there has been further research going forward looking at the mechanisms around ember attack and particular fire behavioural processes which produce that.
Now, you've indicated that you formed the opinion that the house loss index wasn't currently appropriate and fit for its intended purpose. How could that be improved based on your expertise?
I mean, for me, it always comes down to if you don't have a faithful representation of the hazard you're dealing with, then all the systems and frameworks that you're basing upon that particular view of the hazard that you have are going to be compromised. So really what I see as the big gap is trying to actually come up with simulators, fire behaviour simulators, fire spread simulators, which accurately and faithfully represent the hazards which are the most impactful in terms of house loss and other asset damage.
Based on your experience, does the Phoenix simulator have that capability?
It certainly is able to simulate ember attack, various convective processes. I've never really seen it tested and validated in a much of a robust way. But they're continually making improvements to it. There's a new ember dispersion model that's coming out of the Bureau of Meteorology at the moment. It may have already come out. Haven't checked, but yeah. So these improvements are continually being made, and I guess being tested with the best available information that you have. Okay, now that's a sort of slow and laborious process. So it's kind of something which evolves over 5 to 10 year sort of timescales.
The CSIRO have developed their own simulator known as Spark. Does that have the capability in relation to ember density in the context of
yes,
house loss index?
I mean, it has the same capabilities as Phoenix, but it also has different capabilities. And so that's, I guess, one of the things we're actually working on at the moment at the coalface of the research is to try and improve those ember density models and ember transport models in Spark.
Thank you, Professor. The second question that you were asked was whether Essential Energy's profile map in the lead up to preparing for the 2019-2020 bushfire season was appropriate and fit for purpose. And did you form the opinion that it was not?
No, I don't think it was.
And in general terms, why was that?
I think it's, I mean, the data it uses is outdated, I would say. It was very hard to, I guess, pinpoint when the data was sourced, that it was based on. I think just a general lack of transparency around some of the methods that we used to develop that map were a bit concerning.
When you refer to outdated data, are you specifically referring to the reliance on the Johnson et al. Study of 1995, which dealt with the Australian bushfire potential zones?
That's the main aspect, yeah.
Were there others that raised
well,
issue
there was
in your
also,
mind in relation to outdated data?
Yeah, so there was also the total fire ban frequency, which was only sort of, I think, up to 2011. And the other one was the, excuse me.
Was it the spatial patterns of historical fire damage?
No, it was the other one.
Average regional...
the fire start history.
Fire start history.
Yeah, which was just, again, a fairly short period was looked at.
And in the ideal world, dealing with each of those three that you've identified, what sort of time period would one be looking at in terms of collection of data?
Well, again, I mean, the longer span of data you have, the more representative it's going to be. For something like the bushfire potential zones, I mean, it was presented in a paper from 1995. There was nothing in that paper which really suggested when the data that created that map, which was published in 95, was sourced from. But then, you know, you need to think about between 1995 and the 2019-25 season, that's almost, you know, that's 25 years. That's a climatological epoch, if you like. So there's a real need to go back and address, you know, is the information that you're basing your decisions on climatologically relevant, given that we've now moved to another epoch. Moreover, we know within that epoch that we've gone through, there's been significant changes. There's plenty of literature that attests to that.
And significant fire events.
And significant fire events as well, yes.
2003 Canberra, 2009 Victoria,
yeah.
etc. Again, if reliance was to be had in relation to that profile map moving forward, apart from the matters you've just identified in relation to the data, what other improvements do you see could be made to that map if it was to be relied upon?
Well, I mean, I think you need to, I mean, we have a new fire danger rating system now, which essentially takes in all the components that go into that bushfire potential map, you know, fire weather and fuels essentially. So we have the ability now to actually go through and look at all the data. Okay, there's gridded data which goes back, you know, many years. You can look at that and basically build up an idea of what are the most, you know, fire risk averse, fire risk prone places in the state. So you could actually build up a new map, which you could then compare to the old one. I suspect it would be very different. Now,
in relation to that, you took a snapshot in relation to the area around Darrawank based upon automatic weather station data at Taree Airport, and you did that for a period of about 25 years.
Yes.
In terms of doing that analysis statewide, what sort of time, resources and costs could one be looking at to do that across the entire state of New South Wales?
I mean, you could do that, I think, in several months. I mean, once you've done it at one place, it's just a matter of, you know, looping that and reapplying it at other places. You know, the data is all available from the Bureau of Meteorology, so it will be a matter of just ingesting that data within that automated process and producing a map.
And that map, in terms of the percentile, in terms of the Forest Fire Danger Index percentile, what would you be setting that as a benchmark? Would it be the 99.5?
Yeah, so 99.5 or 99.5th percentile FFTI seems to be the one which is in the literature most associated with house loss. So I think that's a sensible percentile to set.
At the moment, the FFDI does not incorporate into it, as I understand it, the C-Haynes index, that is atmospheric instability. And what about the Fern effect? That also is not included into that indices. Is that correct?
No. So the FFDI, I mean, the issue I'm having here is there's an old FFDI which was sort of applied for this event, and there's the new one which has just been launched. The old one is really just temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and rainfall, antecedent rainfall. Yeah, so it's not really taking in any particular fire weather processes which might impact a certain region.
Is there research and work being undertaken in relation to those other matters that may impact fire behaviour and fire spread?
Yeah, there is. I mean, we wrote a paper back in 2010, which I guess kind of piqued interest in these sorts of features, that the Fern Effect feature. That's been picked up in more recent years by the Bureau of Meteorology, who've been looking at sort of downslope windstorms and the role it played in some of the Black Summer fires. So there's, I guess, more awareness and technical understanding of these sorts of processes and their impact on fire danger, but they haven't really been incorporated into risk management systems as such.
Thank you. Can I now just come to question 3 that you were asked to address, which was in these terms, Professor, whether Essential Energy's bushfire risk classifications in the lead up to preparing for the 2019-2020 bushfire seasons were appropriate and fit for intended purpose. Was your answer in response to that question, no, they were not? No. And why was that, in general terms? It's dealt with at page 21 and following of your report, if that assists.
Yes, I mean, there's sort of a lot that goes into these things. And so you're looking at a combination of bringing in the house loss index information, which I've already sort of pointed out some of the issues with, and then you're combining that with some of the other mapping that the bushfire potential zones, which I've said some issues with. So essentially you're taking a whole bunch of different layers of information with various weaknesses and flaws and combining them into a single product. So, once you do that, if you can't have confidence in the actual things which are making up the final product, then I don't think you can really have confidence in the final product, which is comprised of those different parts.
The concerns that you've expressed today and also in your report, can they be addressed based on your understanding of the Ignis Project or not?
I think there's a lot of potential there. I mean, I'm not an expert in Bayesian decision networks. I'm aware of that they're used broadly in various areas of environmental analysis for dealing with uncertain inputs. But the idea of being able to incorporate the uncertainty in various inputs in a statistically robust way is, I think, something that is necessary. The question I still have, though, is, if your inputs aren't covering the full spectrum of uncertainty and the full spectrum of potential behaviour you would expect from a fire, you're still going to, having a Bayesian decision network isn't going to compensate for that. Okay, so the uncertainties which are dealt with within the Bayesian decision network are those which are coming from the inputs.
By that, do I take it if you've got robust data collected over a significant period of time, that's going to result in a more robust outcome and less of a need for involvement from the Bayesian decision network?
No, you'll still need the Bayesian decision network you're always going to have the uncertainty there. Okay, regardless of how robust your data is, it's always going to have uncertainty attached to it. You've also got the uncertainty attached with the modelling methodology like Phoenix, whether that's actually whether that's capturing some of the more rare and more extreme fire behaviours. If it's not doing that, then by the time it gets through to the Bayesian decision network, there's a whole lot of potential information, a whole lot of potential behaviour that a fire can exhibit, which just simply isn't being accounted for within that framework. So if you're not capturing the full potential or the full spectrum of fire behaviour, then what you do at the Bayesian decision network level is constrained by what goes into it. Make sense?
What? Are there any other research tools or simulators or models that, in your opinion, are on par or may exceed the Ignis project in this area or not?
I mean, the Ignis framework I see less as a model, as more of a framework. So, we saw the flowchart earlier with the 4 components, and I think that's the right approach. And I think Bayesian decision networks are the right tool to use at that final stage. As I said before, though, it comes back to sort of making sure that the models you're using to inform the input to that Bayesian decision network are actually the best information you have, and that they are faithfully representing the the actualities of fire behaviour.
Do you have I withdraw that. Now, in relation to the Phoenix rapid fire simulator, Essential Energy engaged the University of Melbourne, and the data that was relied upon was as at 2014. Do you know whether that simulator has been updated periodically since that time in relation to the data or the inputs that are run through that simulator?
I'd be very surprised if it hasn't been updated, although I'm not aware of any literature which sort of documents those improvements.
I just want to deal now very briefly with your response to question 5, which was really whether there's any related information or recommendations that you considered necessary or desirable. And you responded in relation to that in respect of is it pronounced the Fern Effect? Fern Effect. And that's an area that you published in 2010. And in lay terms, is it the effect of there's a wind change? Firstly, do you necessarily need a wind change?
You don't necessarily need a wind change. So the Fern Effect, the paper we wrote in 2010 essentially identified a particular mechanism for the Fern Effect. There's 4 known mechanisms which can drive the Fern Effect. The one we identified as being the most relevant in Australia is as you get an air mass moving towards a mountain range, some of the lower level air can actually be blocked by the mountains, and you get the upper air, which then is potentially drier and potentially warmer, or drier and potentially warmer, will then move in
on the lee side.
On the lee side, in place of the cooler and the air that's been blocked.
And in terms of that effect, how does that drive fire behaviour change?
So the air above is drier, okay, so you get this influx of drier air, and it's also potentially warmer. So what that means is by the time it moves to the surface, it's actually experienced a warming. Okay, so it's providing extra warmth, extra dryness, which has an effect on fuel moisture levels. It's also associated with very strong winds as this sort of flows down the lee side. So you get all the 3 things which are bad for fire: strong winds, dry conditions, and warmer temperatures. And
the Fern Effect, is it usually winds coming from the inland, heading from west to east?
It will be in Australia because all the mountains are on the coast. Yeah.
Now, in terms of the research in relation to that, what, if any, research, to your understanding, is occurring in relation to building that into modelling, and particularly around fire prediction?
None that I'm really aware of, no.
And risk management?
Again, when we were in initial discussions about the new Australian fire danger rating system, these sorts of things were discussed, but ultimately they weren't included in the new fire danger rating system.
And that's the new fire danger rating system that was launched maybe a month or so ago?
September, yeah.
Early this month. Finally, Professor, were you provided with a further statement of Mr Fitzpatrick dated the 21st of September this year? Do you have a copy?
I don't have a copy of me.
I'm just wondering if the Professor could be provided with a copy of Mr Fitzpatrick's statement of the 21st of September. I'm not sure where that's like. Volume 5. Volume 5, tab 50, please. Tab 50, thank you, Officer.
Thank you.
Just take a moment, Professor, just to familiarise yourself with that most recent statement of Mr Fitzpatrick. Were there any matters that you wish to address by way of response to any particular paragraphs contained within that statement?
I guess one of the main things that I tried to emphasise in my initial report, which has been responded to here, was I guess just around the lack of transparency of how the P1 to P4 risk classifications were arrived at. In particular, it's sort of stated in various places that the 4 layers that we talked about before,
those 4 inputs,
are combined with equal weighting. I don't know what that means. I mean, you can combine 4 things in lots of different ways. I mean, you can add them, you can multiply them. So I don't actually understand what has happened to produce that final map. That's still not clear, I think, after reading the third statement. The other thing which I found was interesting was the one of the very last statements where, it makes the point that, Essential Energy really has to, try and manage their limited resources the best way they can. And I guess it struck me as a little strange that, if that's the case, you wouldn't want to be trying to continually engage with making sure you have the best information. So that struck me as a little strange, yeah.
Apart from those 2 matters, anything else that you wish to?
Not really, no.
Thank you. That concludes the examination.
Thank you. Mr Pintos Lopez.
Just a couple of questions, Your Honour.
Thank you.
Professor Sharples, my name's Pintos Lopez and I appear on behalf of Essential Energy. I just have a couple of questions for you. Now, I believe in your report you estimated that the area of forest at Darrawank where this fire occurred, in your view, applying Essential Energy's classification system, I think you concluded that it would be a P3 rather than a P2.
Yeah, well, that was based on a very, very crude and coarse map that I was provided. So, I mean, I wouldn't really put any purchase in that. I would need a much more high-resolution map to make that judgment, yeah.
Yes, but are we to understand that even if it's a P2, and you agreed with Mr Demar that it could potentially straddle between those 2 classifications, that on either view it's not the highest risk?
Yeah, so again, just to clarify, when I agreed it was a P2, that was on the basis that all the other inputs that went into it were appropriate.
Yes.
So based on those inputs, if you take those as appropriate and correct, then something around a P2 would be about where I'd estimate it, yeah.
Yes, but as I understand it from your report, you did indicate that of the 4 layers, you considered that 3 of those layers were sensible. It's just you weren't entirely clear about how they were combined.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, sensible, but perhaps not as robust as they could have been.
Yes. But can I just clarify in relation to this particular area of forest? Is it fair to say that it's a high-risk year, 2019-20, and that's why you're seeing risks emerging that you might not otherwise see in a longer time period?
Well, based on the climatological analysis I did, it was, I mean, there's been worse conditions there. I mean, it was up at the 90, the exact figure here. Yeah, so if we're just considering data from fire seasons, and it was above the 99th percentile, 99.5th percentile. So in that sense, the conditions we got were high, but not unprecedented. Yeah.
No further questions, Your Honour.
Thank you. Ms Woodland.
No questions, thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you. And Ms Ransom.
No questions, Your Honour.
Thank you. Anything arising?
No, thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharp.
Thank you,
You're
Your Honour.
excused.
Your Honour, could I ask for the morning adjournment? We need to do some testing before we bring in the next witness, which is Mr Fitzpatrick, via the audiovisual link.
Certainly. We'll adjourn and resume at 11:30.
Please call.
Coroners call is temporary. Silence, please. All stand. This coroner's court resumes.
Your Honour, I call Mr. Ian Fitzpatrick, who is online, I believe, Your Honour.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, can you see and hear us in the courtroom?
Yes, I can, Your Honour.
All right, you'll just hear from the court officer now. Thanks.
Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Thank you, Mr. Castleton.
Thank you, Your Honour. Sir, would you please state your full name?
Ian Robert Fitzpatrick.
Your business address?
174 North Street, Albury.
And what is your present occupation, Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Manager Network Risk Strategy for the asset management group within Essential Energy.
Have you provided, as part of Her Honour's inquiry, 4 statements?
I have.
And are they dated the 21st of April 2022, the 3rd of June 2022, the 8th of July 2022, and finally the 21st of September 2022?
That's correct.
And do you have copies of each of those statements with you this morning?
Yes, I do.
Are there any corrections that you'd like to make in respect of any of those statements? Her Honour primarily is concerned this morning with the Essential Energy Bushfire risk classification, which sets out 4 levels or categories of risk severity, namely being P1, which is high risk severity, down to P4, which is non-bushfire prone risk. Do you understand that?
Yes.
And to arrive at those particular categories, did Essential Energy firstly engage the University of Melbourne through Dr. Tolhurst to undertake a project to run some numbers and a model in relation to a house loss index?
That's correct. We actually engaged with RFS and University of Melbourne simultaneously to provide that piece of work for us.
And that work was provided in or around 2017, correct?
No, we started it in around 2013.
And when was it complete, the project, with that collaboration between New South Wales RFS and the University of Melbourne?
That was around 2014.
Thank you. And together with what I'll term the house loss index, did Essential Energy also develop a profile map in relation to risk?
That's correct.
And when was that profile map completed, Mr. Fitzpatrick?
We started work on that in around 2010-11. It was completed, I think, in around 2012. 2011, 2012, that year.
And do I understand correctly that in relation to Essential Energy's bushfire risk classification, that it is a combination of both the house loss index and the Essential Energy profile map?
That's correct.
And does that continue today, that the classification system is still based upon those 2 integers, that is the profile map and the house loss index?
That's correct, although we've just had a refresh of the modelling using a new method, and we're at this stage working on implementation of that.
When you refer to a refresh, are you referring to the Ignis Project or something different?
I'm referring to the Ignis Project.
And can I ask you this, please, Mr Fitzpatrick? When did that refresh commence?
So it was done through the ENA, the Energy Networks Australia, because we wanted a nationally consistent approach, and that commenced at around 2018, with results complete around 2019.
And do I take it that the results did not include the 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfire season here in New South Wales?
No, sorry, I should clarify when I say results. The work was completed. There was no actual modelling of anyone's network at that point in time. That was just proof of concept of the method. The following couple of years is when distributors started to take on that approach and start to model with it.
And in terms of essential energy, have you commenced to model the approach, that is the methodology known as the Ignis Project?
That's correct.
And has that modelling concluded where you have a final product or not quite?
We have a preliminary output from that modelling work, and we're just turning our mind to how we interpret those results, having workshops with the relevant experts to understand the results and work on an internal implementation plan, because it potentially has significant consequence on how we manage our business.
And I'll come to that in due course. The preliminary output to which you've just referred, has it had regard to the 2019-2020 bushfire season here in New South Wales?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I'm simply wanting to understand that the modelling that Essential Energy has undertaken over the last 2 years, that is the Ignis framework methodology, has your modelling included what occurred in the 2019-2020 bushfire season?
It would take into account the weather that was consistent with that particular season. I'm not the expert in the technical working of the model. We engage relevant experts to do that, and they could probably best talk to how it might consider what happened in 2019-20. My understanding is that it takes into account the weather that might have been the cause of the 2019-20 fires across the state.
And is one of the relevant experts that your organisation is engaging the University of Melbourne and Dr. Tolhurst's group?
Correct, although Dr. Tolhurst is now retired and it's led by Professor Trent Penman.
And the simulator that is being used, is it still the Phoenix Rapid Fire simulator?
It is, but that could be substituted for any simulator you choose.
Such as the CSIRO Spark simulator?
That's correct.
Now, you've identified that there's been some preliminary outputs. Is there a time frame, Mr. Fitzpatrick, as to when you might be in a position to have a completed final output to commence running the model?
Our target would be to have this operational by the 2023 fire season. So we'll spend the next few months working through the process of implementation of the results and the method into our business.
And on that assumption that by at least the 1st of October next year, I take it you're referring to the statutory bushfire season?
That's correct.
Will that then render the essential energy profile map redundant or not?
That's correct.
And will you, as an organisation, in terms of risk management and risk classification, rely primarily, not necessarily entirely, on the Ignis system?
Or understanding of bushfire risk. So bushfire risk is just one risk we're trying to manage within the business, but yes, that's for bushfire risk, that's correct.
You, I take it, have considered the report of Professor Sharples?
Yes.
Have you seen the second report of Mr. Paul Demar of the 4th of August this year?
So the second?
There's two of Mr. Demar. The most recent one is dated 4 August 2022.
Don't believe I have that one in front of me. I have the 11th of February 2022.
Do you recall being provided with a second report of Mr. Demar?
Vaguely, yes.
The reason I ask you that, Mr. Fitzpatrick, is in your most recent statement, you don't seem to address any of the matters raised by Mr. Demar in his second and final report of the 4th of August 2022, and I was rather wondering whether that was accidental or deliberate, that omission.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure, to be honest, what's happened there. The printed version I have is the first report that Mr. Demar did on the 11th of February 2022. There's been several reports provided and questions coming back and forth, so I apologise for being a little confused on that.
Do you accept that both, at least Mr. Demar in his first report and indeed Professor Sharples in his report, have identified some limitations with the house loss index?
Yes.
And have you, or to your knowledge, Essential Energy, raised those matters identified by Mr. Demar and Professor Sharples with the University of Melbourne, or not?
I have.
And are they matters which, to your knowledge, the University of Melbourne can address moving forward as part of the Ignis project?
I don't know how they're interpreting those. Like I said, when it gets to the technical details of these models, I'll allow the experts to got that between themselves and come to the appropriate conclusions for us.
Do I take it then that you, as the relevant manager of this area, are deferring to relevant experts, and in this case, in respect of the house loss index, the University of Melbourne and the team therein?
That's correct.
Now, you mentioned resourcing earlier in a response to a question. Without breaching any commercial in confidence, is it fair to say that Essential Energy has spent significant sums of money in relation to risk classification and risk management?
That's correct.
And that is an ongoing expenditure item?
That's correct.
And from the preliminary outputs that you've seen to date, and noting, of course, that they're preliminary, are the outputs likely to increase or decrease or remain much the same the outlay for essential energy in respect of its vegetation management requirements?
In regard to the Ignis modelling, it's too early to make that call.
And again, please say so, Mr Fitzpatrick, if it's too early, but from the preliminary outputs that you are aware of through the Ignis project, are you, that is essential energy, likely to see significant reclassification of bushfire zones throughout the state of New South Wales?
Again, that's too early to call at this stage. I was just, there's definitely likely to be changes, but how significant they are and which way they go, it's too early to call.
And in relation to the final outputs in respect of the Ignis project, is that something that Essential Energy will need to run past the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, IPART, or not?
That's correct. They like to be, as a safety regulator, they like to be informed if we're doing anything that substantially changes the way we manage public safety risk on the network or worker safety risk. So we will be consulting with them in regard to the matters that the new modelling may raise.
Because I take
we'll walk them through it so they understand it.
I take it that the new modelling may result in a new classification system in relation to bushfire risk severity.
That's correct.
And based on your dealings and experience with IPART, do you need their approval in relation to a new system or not?
Approval is an interesting word in these matters. We certainly need their support if they do not believe that our approach provides a satisfactory result, and particularly in regard to safety or harm to the community. They can impose their own decisions on us that force us to do specific things. They audit us on how we manage bushfire risk almost annually, and we report on it annually. So they take a keen interest in how we manage that risk.
Thank you. Now, were you able to view the evidence of Professor Sharples this morning, Mr Fitzpatrick?
I did.
Was there anything that fell from his lips that you disagree with or wish to respond to?
No, really.
Do you agree with Professor Sharples' explanation of how the Bayesian network, the Bayesian decision network or the Bayesian network model operates within the Ignis framework?
Yes. I'm not an expert in these, as Mr. Sharples said, he isn't either, but of all the experts we've consulted with and the research and reading we've done on it, it provides a level of improvement on what we've done in the past in terms of modelling.
And do you agree with Professor Sharples' observations, Mr Fitzpatrick, that the inputs are so important in terms of, that is, the data, the length of time that the data is being collected to ensure a better outcome or predicted outcome?
That's true. There's a degree to that, and obviously experts will defer to how accurate and how much they need to make the models as robust as they possibly can. But that's improving all the time. These models are an evolutionary thing, and the input data is also evolving with time and improving. But my understanding of the Bayesian networks is it's a stochastic method for dealing with these kind of events with uncertainty in both data quality and in terms of probability of the event.
And as the manager of Essential Energy's new modelling, that is the Ignis Project, what are your expectations as to how this new model will inform Essential Energy in relation to its decision-making and allocation of resources across the network?
I suspect that it'll provide similar outcomes to our previous modelling in terms of giving us the best understanding we can of how the risk differs across the network, across the entire state. And we can use that to make informed decisions to how we manage the assets.
And by that, do I take it, Mr. Fitzpatrick, that the expectation is that if a particular risk is identified that may be categorised as severe, that enables or potentially enables Essential Energy to allocate adequate resources to address that particular risk?
That's correct. Within the constraints we have with resources, it's about allocating those to get the best, reductions in risk or the best bang for buck that we can.
And that is part of Essential's risk management program, I take it?
That's correct.
Your Honour, that concludes my examination, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Castleton. Mr. Pintos Lopez.
Thank you, Your Honour. Mr. Fitzpatrick, are you able to see and hear me?
Yes.
I just have one question for you. Now, one of the issues that was raised by Mr. Demar in his second report is that the fire modelling used by Essential Energy overstates house losses above historical real-world outcomes. Now, do you have an explanation for why this occurs?
It's probably a question that's best deferred to the risk experts that run the models, but my understanding for that is we're looking at theoretical losses under very worst case conditions. So that would likely overstate the risk. So you can have variables like whether you include suppression efforts from fire agencies or you don't include them, you dial up the curing rates on vegetation and find fuels to 100% versus their normal 90 or 80 in extreme cases. You can tune the dials on these inputs, and one of the things we did ask them to do was tune it to the worst case conditions, because we're making long-term decisions on long-lived assets, and that would probably result in an overstatement of the risk. But we're not fixated in Essential Energy on the actual value. It's the relative difference in risk that it identifies for us that shows that one part of the network might be double, 2, 3, 4 times or 10 times the risk of another part of the network in terms of potential community damage and loss. So it's that relative difference we're more interested in rather than the absolute values.
Thank you. No further questions. Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. Ms. Woodland? I take it no questions, Ms. Woodland?
Sorry, Your Honour, no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Ransom?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything arising, Mr. Castleton?
No, thank you, Your Honour.
Thanks very much, Mr. Fitzpatrick. You're excused.
Your Honour, that concludes the evidence in relation to Your Honour Stage 2 hearing in relation to the fire at Falford Road, Darrawank. Your Honour, I understand the matter's listed for, that is Your Honour's inquiry generally, is listed for directions hearing at 9:30 a.m. on the 14th of December this year. Unless there are any other housekeeping matters, I'd ask Your Honour to stand the matters over generally to that date for directions.
I'll do that now. I'll stand the matters over to 9:30 a.m. on the 14th of December for a directions hearing.
May it please the Court.
We'll adjourn. Thank you.
Silence, please, all stand. This Coroners Court is now adjourned.